Everyone, I hope you found this day, this afternoon, to be as informative and engaging and useful as I have. And we thank you all for sticking around with us throughout the afternoon. We're getting close to the end, and I'm happy that we're ending on a really high note, and I think the next speaker is going to be a real treat for all of us to listen to. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter, who is a university professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. Previously, she served as director of policy planning for the United States State Department. The first woman to hold that position, it might be noted. Dr. Slaughter is a frequent contributor to both mainstream and new media, publishing op-eds in major newspapers, magazines, and blogs around the world. She appears regularly on CNN, BBC, NPR, various other broadcast outlets, and her insights and commentary on American politics are, as that evidence is, widely in demand. Dr. Slaughter has authored and edited several books. I think among the most interesting include A New World Order and a book that I think is absolutely terrific, The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Slaughter. I hope you'll all welcome her with a very, very warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. A year ago, almost a year ago, I was at NYU in a building next to this one at the Personal Democracy Forum, which was run in part by Andrew Richet, whom you just heard from. And there were many bloggers from across the Middle East there over the 2 days because the revolutions in the Middle East were very much under discussion. And at one point, a blogger who has since been arrested, unfortunately released, Alaa Abd el Fattah, was on stage, and someone from the audience, being very moved by the description of just how protesters in Egypt had managed to come together and really mount their revolution. And so someone from the audience said, "What can we do to help you?" We, meaning the great American people. And he looked at us for a second and he said, "Fix your democracy." Completely right? We're out there preaching and I think believing in democracy, in liberty, in justice, in our values. And what increasingly the world sees when they look back at us is a very broken system. So my subject at the end of this day of discussion about how we can restore our democracy is what our obligation is as citizens and how we can come together, or at least what our obligations are to come together to fix our democracy. So I was thinking about this and thinking about the difference between being a citizen of this country and living here. And I say that as the daughter of a Belgian woman who came in 1957 and who took her oath of citizenship at Monticello. And so I haven't always taken American citizenship for granted as the daughter of an immigrant. And when you think about how many people still strive and jostle and sacrifice to be able to come to this country, the difference between living here and being a citizen is an oath. And it's an oath that people like my mother will do a great deal to be able to take. It's an oath to support and defend the Constitution and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. I love that sort of old-fashioned ring, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. When you become a government official, you have to swear a version of the same oath. So really, it's allegiance to the Constitution. Formally, that's what defines us as citizens, that we owe allegiance to the Constitution, we are bound to defend it, to support it. And when we think about that, I think we often forget exactly what the Constitution means. Right? It's kind of, we just take it for granted. It's the Constitution. It's that piece of paper. It's that thing we study. It's the thing you go and see in the National Archives. But what it, of course, really means is the way that we constitute ourselves as a nation and as a polity. And equally importantly, how we reconstitute ourselves as a nation and a polity. There have been 27 amendments. The last amendment, and I actually did have to check on this, I'm a lawyer, but nevertheless, I went back to look, and the last amendment says that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall come into effect until the next election. Fairly sensible principle. You can't vote yourself a raise and get that raise until you've submitted yourself to the judgment of the voters. That is the 27th Amendment. And what I did not realize is that amendment was proposed on September 25th, 1789. It was proposed with the Bill of Rights, with the 10 amendments that became the Bill of Rights. So September 25th, 1789, it was passed, or finally ratified, it finally became the 27th Amendment, in May 1992. So over 200 years later. Now let me just say that the amendment I'm going to talk about today, I sure hope does not take us 200 years to pass. But my point is that we as citizens constituted ourselves, and we have reconstituted ourselves 27 times. Some of those amendments, of course, have come after a civil war. Others have just come after 200 years of lobbying and hard work. I really think that ability to reconstitute ourselves is the core of our citizenship. The Constitution itself proclaims a commitment to a set of values, a set of principles, and then provides a set of what I think of as rules and tools to help us achieve those values. And when we've reconstituted ourselves, when we've passed amendments, we've said, you know, this basic structure that we set out in 1787 as the rules and tools that would allow us to achieve our basic values is not working so well. Our understanding of those basic values has changed. All men are created equal became all white and all black men, and then all white and all black men, whether or not they own property, and then gradually, wonderfully, all men and all women are created equal. And at each point, we had to change the Constitution. And at various times, we've had to change the procedures in the Constitution to help us achieve those principles. But as I think about it, and I was talking to my own children, we were just hearing about the combining of mothering with insights into life, it occurred to me my children have never been alive when there's been a constitutional amendment. It's become harder and harder to do. The last constitutional amendment that I really remember was the effort to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course did not pass. And I think increasingly we have lost the sense that just like we can change the rules of professional sports when they don't achieve what you might want to achieve, we can change the rules that we live by. And I want to talk about the specific values that I think our Constitution commits us to, and the ways in which those values make it incumbent upon us to change. But before I do that, I want to talk about the amendment, the very simple amendment, not simple to pass, but simple to say, that would completely revolutionize our democracy. We can pass an amendment that overrules Citizens United, but better than Citizens United, overrules Buckley v. Vallejo and overrules an entire set of cases about money in politics. If the Supreme Court says money equals speech and hence cannot be regulated in our polity, we as a people are perfectly capable and entitled to say, no, as we define it, we want money out of our politics. Just imagine what that would be like. Just imagine what it would be like to have a constitutional amendment that says, no, we're sorry, money does not equal speech when it comes to politics. Now, of course, I'm being very categorical about this. I am a lawyer, and it could never be quite so blunt, and certainly you do want to be able to contribute to your own candidate, and some money has to be in politics. But we could, at one stroke, restore our democracy by passing a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics. And I hope if you take nothing else away from my remarks today, you will go to the website that says Get Money Out and contribute your support and send it out to absolutely everybody on your Twitter list, on your email list, on your Facebook page, anywhere else. So I said that the Constitution was a set of values, a commitment to a set of values, to a set of principles, and to the rules and tools, and setting forth the rules and tools to help achieve those. So let's talk about some of those values. If you look at the preamble to the Constitution itself, it interests me that justice comes before liberty. I think most Americans, if you ask them, if you wake them up in the middle of the night and you say, okay, American values, what are they? I think most people would come up with liberty first. Maybe not, but I think so. But interestingly, the Constitution says, of course, we come together to establish a more perfect union and to establish justice. To establish justice. That's the very second reason we come together, is to establish justice and to secure the blessings of liberty. So justice and liberty right up there, as I will say in a minute, those of course are very deeply intertwined. Without a measure of justice, liberty is impossible. But we say in our Constitution, we seek to establish justice and to secure the blessings of liberty. If you keep reading, there are a number of things one could pull out, but to me, the next clearest value, as a value, as something that all of us come together and hold dear, is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment enshrines the value of tolerance. Of course, it's worded in terms of Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech. So we talk about it in terms of religion and speech and assembly. But the value that underlies that amendment, our First Amendment, the first right of the Bill of Rights, is the value of tolerance. It says, you have the right to worship in any way you please, and I will accept it. I may not agree with you, I may have completely different views, but I will accept it. And you have the right to say whatever you want. As you'll remember, Justice Holmes, a great statement that I may disagree violently with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So we stand for the principle that we live in a polity where you can worship or not worship in any way you please. You can say whatever you want other than inciting violence or risking people's lives. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, but subject to those exceptions, the third value after justice and liberty is tolerance. And without tolerance, we could not have a democracy. The fourth is equality. Now, in some ways, you might say this is really the first. Because, of course, if we go back to the Declaration of Independence, and I as I said, my mother took her oath of citizenship at Monticello. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. When you grow up in Charlottesville, Virginia, you kind of read the Declaration of Independence sort of alongside Dick and Jane. I mean, Mr. Jefferson walks among us, and we take this very seriously indeed. And of course, the Declaration of Independence starts with all men are created equal. So you might say equality is the very first value. Interestingly, you cannot find it in the Constitution until the 14th Amendment. It's actually very striking. In the 14th Amendment, of course, it says, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. We have then read that back into the Fifth Amendment. So going backwards, the Fifth Amendment says you cannot take life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and due process of law is held to encompass equal protection of the law. But it is interesting that it's not until after the Civil War that we actually write that into an amendment, but we clearly there, and as we've read it back into the Constitution, the equality of all citizens, and unfortunately it is only citizens, but the equality of all citizens before the law. I say it's only citizens because if you do not have citizenship, you are not entitled to the equal protection of the law, but at least for American citizens, equality before the law. So justice and liberty and tolerance and equality, and of course, democracy. Those four values, I will put to you, are the values that are written into the Constitution, and the rest of the Constitution gives us the way that we achieve those values through democracy, through self-government. Each of those five values is under assault. I think as great an assault as at any time in my lifetime, and I grew up in Virginia. I grew up in Virginia in the 1960s. Segregation was still alive and well, so at least, although I was young, I saw the civil rights movement. I think what we face today is a challenge of equal magnitude to the civil rights movement in the sense of how much we have at stake in standing for our values. So indeed, in many ways, I think we are in what Bruce Ackerman, the professor of law at Yale, would call a constitutional moment. He talks about the formal amending of the Constitution, and I've said, do I need a... and I've said that I think that we do need a formal constitutional amendment. But even short of that, this is a moment in which we need to make ourselves heard in terms of the kind of democracy we want to be. And that's also, even informally, what he means by a constitutional moment. To take an informal example, the New Deal was a constitutional moment. We did not amend the Constitution. We did ultimately. But initially, we didn't amend the Constitution. It was a set of legislation. But there was no question that we were saying as a people, we want to go in a different direction in terms of what we expect from our government. So formally or informally, these values are at stake. So start with equality. Much of today has been about the profound inequality that we are facing, an inequality that has grown so dramatically in my lifetime, and I'm not that old. An inequality that is manifest in the kinds of hotels people stay in. And Paul Krugman wrote a wonderful column about growing up and taking road trips and staying in the Holiday Inn, and richer people and poorer people and people in between more or less stayed in the same places. Of course, there were a few people that stayed in the Ritz, but by and large, we still inhabited the same spaces. We inhabited the same parts of airplanes. Private jets were unknown. We inhabited the same parts of all public transportation. There were differences, but we were much more broadly equal. That inequality is so deep now and so reinforcing that even if we were to overhaul our public schools in all the ways that and I'm certain all of us would like to do, they probably could not possibly overcome the inequalities of birth and income. And I see this from a particular perspective. I teach at an enormously wealthy and enormously privileged university, at Princeton University. We are blessed with the ability to have need-blind admissions. If you apply to Princeton and you get in, you come. We will make it possible for you to come no matter what your financial circumstances are. And we work very hard to expand the pool of applicants because we believe that it is part of our mission to be a ladder of social mobility, to bring people who have little and give them the education that will allow them to do whatever they please. But even with need-blind admissions, you are now looking at applicants where if their parents are wealthy, and I include my own children in this, they come in speaking Mandarin and Arabic, and they've spent their summers doing incredible internships all around the world, and they've taken multiple advanced placement courses. They've been tutored in special ways. They've had a chance to found a non-governmental organization, often with their parents' help. They've been able to volunteer and work in Congress and have all sorts of special jobs. They look phenomenal. Again, I'm talking about my own children. Obviously, we want to give them every opportunity. How on earth is someone coming from a family and a town without that income and without those opportunities expected to compete? With the best will in the world, at some point, entrenched privilege simply further entrenches itself. And even our greatest public schools and our greatest universities are not going to be able to overcome that. At that point, inequality becomes entrenched injustice. And we are very, very close to that society-wide. So inequality, or the threat to one of our most fundamental values. Injustice, I said, inequality becomes entrenched injustice. If you think back on the civil rights movement, that sense of inequality, but equally of an inequality that is institutionalized under law through segregation, but even beyond lunch counters and schools, the inequality of knowing that if you come before the courts, you will be treated fundamentally differently than those who have a different color skin, or today, who come from a different income bracket. What we are seeing across the country, and here I do think there are deep similarities between Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. There are many dissimilarities, but one of the deep similarities, I think, is a rage at what people perceive to be a fundamental injustice. Now, the target of that rage differs considerably. Ben Smith of Politico had a wonderful diagram, a Venn diagram of the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. And what he said was both sides are very angry at big business and big government, essentially distorting our democracy. The Tea Party tends to blame big government. Occupy Wall Street blames big business, but there is an intersection, and what there is fundamentally is a rage at a sense of deep injustice, that it's simply not fair, that those who didn't have the connections, who didn't have the income, paid a much, much higher price. So justice, injustice, equality, inequality, that anger, of course, in turn breeds intolerance. Now, I have not seen Patriocracy. I can't wait to see it. I will not be here tonight, but I'm going to be watching on my computer, and I'll be showing it to my kids. But I am certain, even from the clips and knowing what I know about the film, that sense of injustice, of inequality, that rage has bred an extraordinary intolerance, a genuinely frightening intolerance. Right before I came in here, I was looking at my email, and there was an email from Neera Tandon, who is the president of the Center for American Progress, about this young woman at Georgetown named Sandra Fluke, who stood for the proposition that contraception should in fact be paid for, and cited a friend of hers who needed it for medical reasons. The hatred, really the obscenities that have been visited upon this young woman by Rush Limbaugh and others, commenting on her own sexuality, commenting on things I'm not even going to repeat here in terms of the abuse that had been heaped on her. That is a terrible symptom. We see that intolerance in our radio shows, our TV shows, our political dialogue. That's a cancer. That's a very deep cancer. And as I said before, without tolerance, we can't have a democracy. And honestly, depending on where you stand politically, you might think it's really much worse on the right, but if you're on the right, you certainly see plenty of examples on the left. Both sides have to recognize we are both required to put aside what we're certain to be right and to listen to each other. So if you put all that together, inequality, injustice, intolerance, you come up ultimately with a broken democracy. I genuinely believe our democracy is broken. In fact, when I'm abroad, to go back to my opening point with an Egyptian blogger, when people ask me how I can possibly justify a political system that runs entirely on money, I can't. I really do think our democracy is broken. I believe we can fix it, and I believe one of our greatest strengths as a country is not that we're by any means perfect, but that we have the means to fix it. But I think it's broken. Our people are not being represented. That's the definition of a democracy. It is a government by the people, representative democracy. The people are represented. We as a people are not being represented by our government. So what's our obligation? Obviously, I said to begin with, I think we all have an obligation to do what we can actively, recognizing that it is possible actually to reconstitute ourselves as a people. Even more fundamentally, and I would just follow you, we have an obligation to act. We are all extraordinarily busy. But to the extent it's our democracy that's broken, it is us who has to fix it. We have the power as citizens. We're given that power to actually change things. And I want to propose that in taking action, we be guided by two more American values. These are not written into the Constitution, but I think they're every bit as important and every bit as evident in our history, in our songs, in our poems, in our civic life. The first is humility. Now, this is one generally where people think I've probably gone a little off the rails. I can tell actually by a couple of expressions. Humility? An American value? Well, I would note that our founding father, some think our greatest president, George Washington, was noted above all for his humility. Indeed, that's largely what defined him as a general, as a president. It was something he believed was indispensable to great leadership. And indeed, if you move forward and you look at Lincoln and Roosevelt, if you look at Eisenhower, who may not have been our greatest president, but was certainly one of our greatest generals, one of the things you will find is a sense of humility. Sometimes it's humility before a higher being. Sometimes it's humility before the forces of history. Sometimes it's humility in the face of nature. But it's a sense of forces larger than we are. I would suggest to you that our very belief in progress, in the sense that we can make things better, reflects a sense that we are radically imperfect now. And that at our best, that humility is woven into our determination to change. I also think humility is the handmaiden of tolerance. If you believe that you have a lifeline to the truth, you will be deeply intolerant. If you believe that you think you're right, but you're honestly not certain and you have something to learn from others, and if you believe it takes greater courage to admit that you're wrong than to insist that you're right, then you're on your way to genuine humility. In political discourse, I think we have to actually assume positive intent. This is hard. Given many of the people who are currently dominating our politics, it is hard. But we just heard there are many people, and I've met many, who are our elected representatives, who are trying to do the best they can. Assuming positive intent, this actually comes from Indra Nooyi, the CEO of Pepsi, who said she learned this from her father. It means when you hear something, even if you radically disagree, assume that the person is not evil or trying to be evil, but actually is acting out of positive intent, even if you radically disagree with what they say. That's hard. That's a discipline, but if we can't practice it, how can we expect anybody else to practice it? And how can we fix our politics? And finally, the value of faith. Not written into the Constitution, but as much an American birthright as anything else. It can be religious faith, it can be civic faith. I put to you that in a country of many, many different religions, it is our civic faith. It is the faith in that very set of rules and tools as to how we constitute ourselves as a people that is our overriding characteristic. It's also a faith that we can make things better. I do believe as Americans we are naturally much more optimistic than many other peoples, not all, but again, I'm half European, and certainly relative to my European relatives, they think it's naivete. I take it as a very strong force. And it's very closely allied with hope. I want to leave you again with the oath of allegiance, the oath of citizenship, what it means to be a citizen, which I have said is a commitment to our Constitution, to defend it, to support it. Woodrow Wilson, after giving the oath of citizenship, turned to the new American citizens and asked them the following question. You have just taken an oath of allegiance to the United States. Of allegiance to whom? Of allegiance to no one, unless it be God. Certainly not of allegiance to those who temporarily represent this great government. You have taken an oath of allegiance to a great ideal, to a great body of principles, to a great hope of the human race. Leaving aside the sort of American exceptionalism that is deeply embedded in that we are the hope of the human race, I'm not sure I would go that far. But I would say that an oath of allegiance to principle and to hope is the core of what the Constitution's about. And the only way we're going to fix our democracy is to have the humility and the faith to believe that we can and to get out there and do it. Thank you. Sure. I'm happy to take a few questions. Yes?
He wrote, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. And so, over 215 years later, we still have this frightful despotism of the two-party system of which we're all disgusted with. As we see them taking the money, we want to get money out. But do you think that there's any kind of a good chance that our entrenched politicians will take it upon themselves to actually create and do the parameters of a constitutional amendment, which requires two-thirds of the House to pass it, two-thirds of the Senate, and three-quarters of the states? That's a really hard job. So instead, I'd like your comments on my proposal that we, to get the best leaders who will do this for us, we should simply, state by state, change our voting method. Simply expand the plurality method of voting into score voting. Are you familiar with what score voting is?
I am.
Okay. That's an option so that instead of just voting for your favorite person, you now have the option of giving each and every candidate a score on the ballot. So if you like three candidates equally, you don't have to choose one and seriously devalue the other. What we have now, and what even IRB, which is utilized, I think, in San Francisco, that's still a majority wins voting system. Hitler himself could have gotten a majority, probably, you know, at 51%, but we all knew him to be the megalomaniac that he was.
I hope that's not applause for Hitler. Okay, I think they're telling. All right. Okay. So yes. So the first thing to say is I'm not opposed actually to a party system. I don't believe. I'm a lawyer. The law in this country, the common law system, does believe in the adversary process. It believes in competition. It believes in sharpening the truth. I don't innately object to two parties. I object to two parties where the entire system is dominated by money. So I think actually you can have a two-party system that works, you can have a three-party system that works, you can have a parliamentary system that works. I am perfectly amenable to anything that will change our politics. I will start with the open primary now in California. I think there are a lot of different voting systems. I'm perfectly amenable, particularly to their being tried at the state or the local level. I think the simplest way overall to guarantee that many, many, many more people are willing to run for office is to change the money in politics. I'd run for office tomorrow if I weren't going to spend all my time raising money. As it is, no chance. And I can think of countless people who would say the same. So in the end, if you're only getting the people who are willing to brave that, you're getting a very small slice of the population. So that, to me, is the simplest way, but there are many other ways we can reform our politics. And if we can get people in office who have time to do that and not spend all their time raising money and who are willing to run in the first place, I think there's any number of reforms we can experiment and undertake. But I will say one last thing. I do believe that the start of your question is exactly the assumption I want to challenge. People say, oh my God, we couldn't pass a constitutional amendment. Oh, that's so hard. Well, yes, it's hard, but we've done it 27 times before, and if people believe they can do it, they can do it. It's absolutely absurd to think that we as a people can't, in fact, change the Constitution. But it's a vicious circle. You believe we can't do it, and you're not going to try. So at least I think we have to remind ourselves that there's nothing in stone about the words on that paper. We can change it, and we can change it in a way that will make us a far better democracy. Yeah.
I have a question. The First Amendment, I'm not proposing that one tinker with it, but what is the but when you consider the capacity for a political ad, whether it's Willie Horton in Bush versus Dukakis, when they had that famous ad, which made public, apparently, I'm not a politician, but it switched something like 8% within a 3-day period.
Yes.
So the mere existence of an image on TV can do this to our politics. Or Mr. Atwater, who ran various campaigns for President Bush, and most recently, the SWIFT bill, which has even given us a new verb. Now, my question to you as an expert in the Constitution is there any fear in your mind that our definition of free speech encompasses all these things, which are really imagery to expedite propagation of these truths, if you allow that to be as the business. Is there some way we can demand that anything that goes out as political advertisement or political advocacy have some element of truth in it? You can't just turn out a picture, horrify the public, and then we swing to the opposite side.
So I'm not sure we could go quite that far, although an amendment that said we reject that you cannot use money other than as provided by government in politics subject to certain limits would in fact be amending the First Amendment. Right? The Supreme Court is interpreting the First Amendment to mean you can't bar the use of money in politics. So if we were to add another amendment, where we are amending the First Amendment, we are telling the Supreme Court, we are telling ourselves as a people, no, this is what we mean by speech, and it does not include certain categories of political expenditure. Now, if you do that, It is also then possible, if you are dependent on public funding of elections, as many other countries are, you could easily set up a public watchdog and say, you know, if a certain number of your ads don't meet a certain test, you don't get that funding. Right? That you can do. There are various, you don't have to write that into the Constitution, but again, if you only getting funding, principal funding from the government and small donations, it's much easier, I think, to control within a broad band the relative truth in advertising of our politicians. Yeah.
Somebody sees the Patriocracy's film as electioneering, does that mean like someone like me, I couldn't give Cindy and Brian $1 million to go promote this film?
Well, that's what that's what lawyers are for. and I don't mean that as facetiously as it sounds, right? There's an incredibly rich body of First Amendment jurisprudence that are all about what exactly do any words mean. Now, as if I'm your justice, I would say, look, you can definitely distinguish between what was it you said, aggressively nonpartisan, or obviously something that is clearly trying to be about the political system as a whole, rather than supporting one party or another. Now, there are no perfect bright lines, but I think you could articulate a legal principle around partisanship that would say, no, of course, if you are talking about our political system as a whole and you are funding NGOs or films or activism of any kind, that is perfectly fine. What we're talking about is who wins an election and who determines who wins an election. And right now, if you have $5 million, you can keep a candidate alive. And you can predict who's going to win by what size their budget is. That is not actually, I think, free speech. It's not free speech in the sense that the First Amendment was initially about the vibrancy and strength of our democracy. And now I think we've interpreted the First Amendment in such a way that it is actively undermining our democracy. You, the filmmaker? Absolutely.
I'd like to put a question to you, Anne-Marie, Dr. Slaughter, of a question that's been put to me a lot. And that is, it's great to see this crowd here, and thank you all for coming today, but how do we make this subject matter, this topic, I think if we realize how important this is, and I think we all here in this room agree how important this subject matter is in our democracy, but how do we make this subject matter as popular as our national pastime of the NFL or baseball or American Idol or whatever it is? How do we elevate this? Because that's really, the critical mass is really the only way we're going to be able to get this subject matter to the point where we all, as citizens and as a population, can really change the culture.
I think the answer is that we will get critical mass as to the extent we convince people that change is possible. People respond immediately when they see it, but they don't think they can actually do something about it. And indeed, the initial answer was exactly, well, it's the system's fixed. It's the money itself makes it worse. We can't actually change it, which is why I focused on the process of constitutional amendment. Now, actually, probably if you got close to a constitutional amendment, Congress would be sufficiently worried that it would start reforming itself, right? You don't necessarily have to go all the way, but I would certainly start with the proposition that we can go all the way, that it is perfectly possible. I think that was a large part the secret of the Obama campaign, right? What happened was that people, particularly young people who were too young to be sufficiently cynical to know any better, really started to believe they could do it. And the more people thought they could do it, at least in my community, the more small groups there were, and the more neighborhood parties, and the more donations, and the more My Obama pages started going, and the more groups started, putting out songs and other things, because people started believing they could do it. Well, if you can do that to elect someone, you can surely do it to change the system in such a way that you're saying to people across the country, we changed the system this way and you can be part of governing us, right? Which right now you can't, and the people see that. So I would start in part with education about how we have changed the system in the past. We focus so intensively on what's wrong, and I really am looking forward to seeing your film in the sense of a call to action. But I think in part of the point of getting people to then think you can translate that to action has to come with a belief that it can be done. And maybe that's in part looking at where change has been made. I mean, the fact that California now has an open primary is a big change. Oregon has vote by mail, right? When I tell people that, oh, really? You can, vote by mail? You don't have to be there on the Tuesday when you're supposedly working? Changes that have worked and people believing that they've worked. I do think once you get that belief, there will then snowball because you're tapping into tremendous rage. It's just we don't really believe we can change it. Yeah.
The sports analogy is really very interesting because when teams win, it attracts attention. And when people see that by people standing up and having their voices heard, that will attract attention.
I agree.
To reinforce that. We've seen a few issues where people have, stood up and raised their voices and they've seen change. And the more that we can do that, the more people will continue to do that, and it feeds on itself. But the sports analogy, I think, is really an excellent answer to how to do this.
Right. I would also say we do have to have some patience. I mean, I read, what was it, yesterday's Times, that a millisecond is too long when you're waiting for a Google search, and I agree, I'm increasingly impatient. But, maybe it doesn't take 200 years. I gave you the example of the 27th Amendment. But just imagine if we were in the late 19th century and we as women in this room wanted the right to vote. It took almost 3 decades to get the right to vote. Right? And I'm hoping it doesn't take that long, but you have to tell people, look, change in this country comes, but it's not going to come overnight, and you have to start organizing and start telling people it's happened and tell the stories of how change has happened in the past. Now, let's hope time has telescoped enough that 3 decades is closer to 1, but it's not going to be tomorrow, and we have to believe that we're in this for long enough to make a fundamental change. Yes, thank you.
The other element you touched on, much of I was going to ask as my question, but I think that the other element is that you have to find a way to have people feel a sense of pride in being part of whatever
Yes,
the
yes.
movement is. We went to the moon, we abolished slavery, we built 100,000 airplanes during World War II, we had the civil rights movement, and people reached a point where they were proud to say, I'm a part of that. And that, I think, is an essential element in whatever we do going forward.
Thank you. I completely agree. And I will just say again, in terms of traveling abroad, I wrote this book, The Idea That Is America. I started writing it in 2004. And what the reason I wrote it was I was traveling through airports and I was handing them my passport, and I've always been very proud of that passport. And as I would hand them that passport, I would see the photographs of Abu Ghraib looking out at me from every magazine. That horrible picture of the person on the box with the hood and the wires, some kind of hideously twisted distortion of the Statue of Liberty. And I couldn't stand it. I could not stand the idea that that's what our country stood for. And I wrote the book not to say how great we were, but to say we have been able to fix our flaws in the past, we can do it again. And that sense of pride when Obama was elected and going back to Europe and my Belgian relatives and others and saying, look, I know we have many flaws. I do not think we're the latest great hope of mankind. I think our values are universal values. But you know what? We just elected an African American. We just elected somebody who, when I was growing up, couldn't sit at the same lunch counter. Now, that's not bad. That's a sense of pride in what we can accomplish, and it's a perfectly good pride. It's a pride, a patriotism that I do think can be rekindled and needs to be rekindled if we're going to make this happen. Yes, it is an honorable pride. And I say that with humility. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much.